So brief history of wild rice in California. This is not going to fully cover wild rice in California, but I will do my best to cover at least sort of an overview of production practices as well. So first of all, to preface, so what is wild rice? A lot of people think that because it has rice in the name, that it is the same as the rice, cultivated rice that we grow widely in the Sacramento Valley, but it is technically not a rice, and it's not in the same botanical family as white rice. So white rice is a rice sativa, and the most commonly cultivated species of wild rice that we grow is Zizania palustris. So they're not even in the same family. They are both grasses, but not in the same family. It's an annual plant, and it's native to the Great Lakes region of North America. So the origins of wild rice cultivation in the United States, scientists suggest that we've been growing wild rice, indigenous peoples have been growing wild rice in Minnesota for a really long time, at least 1,000 years prior to the point that it was cultivated by those people. It's thought to have been found in Minnesota. It's the centerpiece of the Ojibwe people's diet, and it is traditionally harvested by wooden boats, and it is still cultivated to this day. And you can see there a picture of the cultivation practices. So pushing boats and tapping with a stick to get the wild rice seeds to shatter into the boat. And there is some commercial production as well, but this is the traditional method of growing wild rice. There are other wild rice species in the United States. Zizania texana is found in Texas, and it's actually considered endangered at this time. It's only found on a very small area of the San Marcos River. And then Zizania aquatica is more widespread in the south. It is also a major food source for indigenous people, but it is not currently cultivated commercially in the US. There is one other wild rice species that is found outside of North America, and it is Zizania latifolia, and it's the only species, again, found outside of North America. It's native to Asia. It is typically not eaten for the seed, but it is in fact eaten for the stem. So the bottom part of the plant here is the part that's typically eaten. And it is found somewhat in the United States. It's not considered invasive at this point in time, but it is on a watch list for potentially becoming invasive. So one of the questions that I wanted to kind of cover briefly today is wild rice considered domesticated? And any of those folks that know me from the rice side of things know that I like to talk about domestication because of weedy rice, right? The wheat that we have in our rice systems. So sort of per domestication or definition of a domesticated plant, if it's fully domesticated, that means that the seeds will stay on the panicle or seed head until harvest. So we know that weedy rice is not domesticated because of that, right? It shatters. That's why it's a pest. Wild rice is not fully domesticated. The seed shatters, so it doesn't stay on the panicle until harvest. And that can be a good thing, right? So for people that are harvesting by hand, if they're hitting the plant with a stick or a tool of some sort, they want it to shatter off, right? But for those of us that are using our combine, it's better for it to stay on the panicle until we harvest it. So there are no wild rice varieties in California that are non-shattering completely. All of them shatter to some extent. The other thing that makes it what I would consider not completely domesticated is that it has dormancy. So the seeds basically need to have some sort of dormancy breaking period before they're planted again in the spring. So wild rice, and I'll cover this a little bit later, but typically for seed storage over the winter has to be wet chilled, kind of like I do when I'm trying to wet chill my weed seeds for planting in the spring. So the wild rice seed needs to be wet chilled over the winter, and in order for it to be able to germinate in the spring. A quick comparison here of wild rice versus rice, or rice sativa. So I don't know if everyone can see here on the left, but this is a botanical illustration of zizania. But the kind of interesting thing about it that I think is pretty cool here, and it makes it very different than Oryza sativa, is that the panicle heads, and there's panicles, hopefully everyone can see my mouse here, the panicle heads there on the far left and in the middle here. The bottom of this is actually the male part of the panicle, and the top part is the female part. So this is the part that would be harvested for seed. So the bottom part is the flowers, or not the flowers. The top part is the flowers or the florets, and the bottom part would be the male part, the pollen. Okay, so a little bit different than rice, which is over here where the flowers are self-contained, right? The female and male parts are all in one part. You can see the seed looks a little bit different as well. So wild rice seeds have an on the end of them typically, whereas our rice varieties or rice sativa do not. So just a little bit of difference here in how they look. So how did wild rice come to California? It's been grown in California as a commercial crop since 1977. It was brought over to California from Minnesota. The story goes that it was brought in an ice chest. The first grower that planted in California was Vince Vanderford, and it was planted in the Yuba area in 1972, in just a couple of acres. So it's a really recent crop in California. By 1972, or by 1977, that first large commercial crop was about 10,000 pounds. And then the peak was in the mid-1980s when we had about 15,000 acres planted across the state. Now it's roughly 10,000 acres per year. That goes up and down a little bit, but about 10,000 acres per year. And we're actually, in terms of production, we produce more than Minnesota now. So some of our production practices in brief, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but the areas, we sort of have two areas. So we have the northern area, which is the Lassen, Modoc, Shasta area, a little bit cooler up in that area. And then further south, sort of in the midst of our rice growing area in the Sacramento Valley, we also grow in Butte, Sutter, Yuba, Placer, Yolo, Sacramento counties. I think at some point in the past, there was also rice grown over in Lake County, wild rice, but there's really two distinct sort of growing areas that are geographically distinct from one another. The northern part, there's no rice production up there, but down here, typically wild rice is grown in the same fields that we'd be growing rice. Okay, and we use many of the same practices, similar practices, and our rice fields are very well set up, obviously, to rotate to wild rice if we wanted to down here. Whereas in the north, people are planting wild rice specifically, maybe rotating with other crops, but their fields are set up specifically for wild rice production. The season, it's planted sometimes as early as February, March. It's a little bit more cold tolerant than our Oryza sativa. Keep in mind that it came from Minnesota, right? So a little bit cooler area. But the average planting date is about April to May. If it goes further than that, it can be planted as late as June, but runs into some of the same problems that we have with our rice when we plant too late. The crop is a very short cycle, from about 90 to 115 days, comparing that to rice, which is closer to 120 days. So a bit of a shorter planting to harvest period. Like I mentioned earlier, after harvest, we typically store our seeds in bins, and the bins are filled with water, and then those bins have to be refrigerated or kept cold. And that water needs to be changed every so often. Otherwise, you can get, the seed might start to rot. And this whole process is done to break dormancy. So I mentioned earlier that it's not fully domesticated. I did do some testing to try to plant wild rice right after harvest in the past, and it doesn't germinate. So it needs that wet chilling period in order for it to be able to germinate in the spring. Some folks up in the north and I read this, so people can correct me if I'm wrong here, but sometimes people will let some of the rice shatter onto the ground, and then it'll overwinter in the field, and then you'll get volunteer plants the next spring. So I don't know for sure that that's true, but that's what I've heard. So again, a little bit different than our rice varieties, rice production. The varieties that we have, there's, I believe there's also a few others, but these are the most widely known varieties. So Johnson was the first variety planted in California, and it's a little bit later maturing than the other varieties. K2 is the dominant variety that was grown in California originally, but it's been pushed out a little bit by Franklin when Franklin was released. So K2 was developed in Minnesota. Franklin was also developed in Minnesota, but that's, again, the most widely grown variety in California now. The yields of Franklin are a bit higher than K2 and Johnson, and certified seed was available for a time through UC Davis. I'm not actually sure of the current status of that. I was unable to find that on the CCIA website. I will check into that, but I don't believe that we have certified seed available currently. There was a wild rice breeding program at UC Davis for a while, but I believe it is not continuing at this point in time. Yields are a little bit different than rice, typically ranging from 1,200 to 1,600 pounds per acre. But the value of wild rice in terms of like commercial, price is quite a bit higher than rice. So for growers, this makes sense that even though the yields are a little bit lower, that it would be worth it to grow wild rice. Okay, so I'm going to get into the pests because this is the focus of what I'd like to talk about here. So major pests, a lot of similar pests to what we find in rice. So rice water weevil, right there, typically feeds on the roots. The larvae feed on the roots. Leaf miner, you can see up here. I didn't have a good picture of a rice leaf, but that's what a leaf miner looks like. Armyworms, I haven't heard of this being a large problem in wild rice, but they are known to be able to eat wild rice. And then midges. So those are sort of our major pest species, major insect pests. Diseases, we've got, again, very similar diseases to those found in rice with a couple of exceptions. We've got stem rot. So you can see stem rot over here on the right, and aggregate sheath spot. So again, very similar diseases, and you'll see a lot of our pesticides are therefore also similar. Diseases continued. Sorry, this picture is not quite as great as I'd hoped. Phytophthora crown and root rot. I was unable to find a good picture, unfortunately, because we haven't done a lot of research in wild rice in California. We don't have a lot of data on wild rice, and so the disease photos, I couldn't find any that were actually on wild rice. But crown and root rot can be found in other species, I believe in potatoes. This is the same species as found in potatoes. Leaf spot blight as well. And sorry, it looks like I copied and pasted that twice. So seedling disease is the same as the one up here. Leaf spot blight is the one I tried to grab a photo of there, but it didn't turn out so well. Our weed species, similarly, are the same as rice. Cattail can be a problem. Cattail is a perennial weed, and once it's established well in a field, it's very hard to get rid of. Again, this could be a problem, especially in fields that are not being rotated out of rice or wild rice. So cattail would be, can be a bigger problem, and it's really hard to get rid of. Even in regular rice fields, it doesn't respond well to treatment with herbicides. Really, tillage is the best way to get rid of it. A reminder of some of our major weed species. Again, these are the same as would be found in rice. So our watergrass, the Echinocloa complex, Leptocloa. The one thing, and I'll mention this a little bit further on, is that wild rice is typically flooded quite a bit deeper in terms of the amount of water we put on the field. So we're talking like a really, really deep flood compared to what we typically do in rice. And the great thing about that is that it does suppress the grasses quite a bit better than when we do a shallower flood. So the watergrass species should be quite well suppressed, with maybe the exception of late watergrass. Springletop would also be quite well suppressed by a deep, deep flood. This is not the case for our aquatic sedges and broadleaf plants. So these might be more competitive in a wild rice field than they are in a rice field. So small flower umbrella sedge, rice field bulrush, red stem, Sagittaria or arrowhead, and then water plantain, Elisma. So water plantain and Sagittaria, I think, have been at least listed thus far, as the two most competitive weed species in wild rice. All the wild rice growers that I talked to listed birds as definitely their main pest problem. For some reason, and this is unknown why, but the cowbirds and blackbirds really, really like wild rice fields, and they cause a lot of damage. They can begin feeding when the rice reaches the milk stage, and they really just hammer the rice after that. Crop losses of 10% or more are known, and I would say this is probably more likely when fields are isolated. So if there's a wild rice field and nothing else really tasty around, they would be attracted to the wild rice field. There's not a lot known about the birds in terms of studying sort of where they're coming from and why they're so attracted to wild rice. So we don't really know if they're migratory or if these birds come back to the same fields every year. Okay, so sort of where are we with pesticides in California? So wild rice really has very few registered pesticides, period. In terms of herbicides, we really only have Shark H2O or carfentrazone as a post-emergent. Glyphosate can be used, and it appears as though quite a few growers do use this as maybe a pre-emergent or to clean up fields maybe during fallow years. So it is allowed to be applied. Obviously, it would be as sort of a stale seedbed treatment. But that's really it. So as a post-emergent, we only have carfentrazone. And Shark or carfentrazone only controls our sedges and some of our broadleaves. It does not provide any grass control. So really, this is there's really not a lot for us to use here. I would say pretty much no tools to use for weed control. Our insecticides, there's a little bit, there's one more registered in terms of numbers here. So malathion, and that's pretty widely used. I looked up some of the pesticide use reports. Warrior and Mustang. Warrior and Mustang, though, are same mode of actions. You're not getting any rotation value there. But to my knowledge, there's not quite as much of a problem with some of these insect pests in wild rice. So for the time being, I think it's working, but who knows in the future. But again, just not very many tools in the toolbox. Fungicides is a very similar situation to rice. Quadris and Quilt XL, so azoxystrobin, and then the mixture of azoxy and propiconazole. Again, just not very much to work with here. And I will say I haven't got that many farm calls in terms of diseases of wild rice. Most of the issues seem to be regarding birds and also some comments about weed control. I mentioned before, so cultural controls for weeds, it's really maintaining that 14 to 18 inches of flooding. So most growers put on a deep flood at the beginning of the season. Wild rice can tolerate very deep flooding. And then maintaining that deep flood will keep most of the grass species down. Again, doesn't really impact our sedges or aquatic weeds, but for grasses, it's a good control method. For birds, growers use a variety of tactics. I've seen bird cannons, although they don't seem to respond that well to the bird cannons. Also scarecrows, balloons, variety of very creative control methods. Lasers. For diseases and insects, there are no known cultural or biological controls.